Welcome everyone to the Korea Economic Institute of America's webinar today on entitled Diplomacy or Readiness, U.S. South Korea Military Exercises and Denuclearizing North Korea. I know for most of us, COVID-19 has dominated much of our personal and professional lives these past few weeks, but Pyongyang has made it clear that it will not be forgotten. Between the increased North Korea missile launches and the rumor mill that has run rampant this week about Kim Jong-un's health, there is just as much reason as there ever was to critically think about how we approach Pyongyang. And that's why we're so happy at KEI, we're so happy to have with us today Terry Roerich, a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, to talk with us about the intersection of security in the U.S. ROC alliance and diplomacy with North Korea, and sort of finding that right balance between the two. Terry literally co-wrote the book on the U.S.-Korea alliance in 2018, and also writes on North Korea's nuclear weapons program, human rights, and issues pertaining to the northern limit line, the maritime border between the two Koreas. For more on Terry and his background, I would encourage you to check out the email you received today with the link for today's event, and the paper for today's program, which is forming the basis, the paper that was written for today's program, forming the basis for Terry's remarks, can also be found on our website, keia.org. There's one last thing I'd like to mention before turning things over to Terry, and that is for questions today, we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom. You'll find that at the bottom of the screen. If you can just write in your questions as they arise, that'll help us move straight away into the Q&A after Terry is finished with his opening remarks, pretty much summing up some of the points in his papers and possibly expounding upon some of the arguments that he makes there. So without any further delay, I'll now turn things over to Terry.
Thank you very much, Kyle. And let me start first by thanking Ambassador Stevens and Kyle and everyone at KEIA for this opportunity and for all the work you do in promoting greater understanding about Korea. You folks do a fantastic job. I have to start by saying the usual caveat that these views are my own and do not represent those of the Navy or the Defense Department or the U.S. government. And so let me begin by saying that this is certainly a controversial issue, looking at the changes to the exercises in response to diplomacy, and there are no necessarily easy answers to this. There are strong views on both sides of this issue that it was a mistake or it was the right thing to do. My approach to this paper, however, was to try to look at this without any particular axe to grind and or political goal in mind, but to try to look at this in an objective fashion and look at the different elements that make up this question. I also want to thank General Vincent Brooks and the several other military officers who have had experience in Korea that I have spoke with that have helped me sort out these difficult and controversial issues. I really appreciate their gracious giving of their time and expertise as this project took shape. So it all starts in June of 2018 after the U.S. and North Korea conclude the summit in Singapore. President Trump goes and gives a press conference after those events, and in that press conference announces that the, quote, war games are, that we will stop the war games because they are costly and they are provocative. It was a very surprising announcement. Certainly, South Korea had not been consulted. The story is that many in the Pentagon were not aware that this was going to be coming. And so a very sort of difficult announcement that dumbfounded many. Some certainly cheered the announcement as a move to push diplomacy and to support diplomacy. Others criticized it as a foolish, ill-advised move, certainly in how it was done, but also what was done. But also for the sake of my paper, the question about what impact changing and or suspending the exercise structure would have on military readiness. And so after the summit, the exercise schedule changed. Some of the exercises were suspended, some of them were altered, renamed, oftentimes scaled back, reconfigured. The paper has a detailed review of the different exercises and how those changes happen. I probably won't have time to go through that all today, but if you are interested, again, it is detailed in the paper. But when you look at all of that and the context this is in, at its core, the U.S. South Korea alliance relationship is a military alliance. And that military alliance is founded on the U.S. commitment to defend South Korea. To do that requires the ability to work together for the militaries to be trained, to be familiar with their environment, and that does not come automatically. That requires exercises to be able to work in that environment, to be able to work together. Yet, the military, of course, is only one tool that states have to achieve their national goals, and diplomacy is certainly another important part of that. And diplomacy and military strength often support each other. And so when you look at all of these things together, we are now 2 years in from the announcement and the Singapore summit. This paper looks at what I think are some fundamental questions in this regard. And that is, how did the alterations to the exercises affect readiness? And was any associated risk that may have been generated by changing or suspending or altering the exercises worth the risk for the possible gains it would accrue to support diplomacy? And so I went to look at what the different exercises were and such and how they were changed. Again, that is in the paper for more detail. But let me begin by talking about what the purpose of the exercises are in the Korean theater. And I think there are 3 important reasons for the continued exercises in Korea. First of all, it is crucial to ensure that both the United States and South Korea and together can conduct combined combat operations to be able to defend South Korea. U.S. and South Korean forces have long been organized under a simple mantra of fight tonight. And to be able to do that, to be able to coordinate, that requires exercises and regular intensive training that is part of that. The Korean theater, though, has some difficult challenges that come along with maintaining that element of military readiness. First of all, U.S. military personnel, most are rotated to Korea on 1-year rotations. So they spend their first 4 to 6 months becoming acclimated to the assignment and to the area, then have only about 6 months or perhaps even less remaining to be able to continue what they do. Then the military personnel are supported by reservists who come in for short periods of time. These reservists often don't have a lot of experience in Korea, and again, spend even a far shorter time in Korea to be able to support and conduct their assignments. Then lastly, South Korean military personnel are also rotating during all of this. And so what you have created here is a complex, regularly shifting personnel matrix that has a lot of moving parts, a lot of parts that don't necessarily stay in place for very long. To make sure this all works requires regular, extensive exercising to ensure the proficiency of individuals, of individual units, but then also how the US and South Korean forces can all work together. In addition, another challenge is that you have 2 allies who have different cultures and different languages. And so being able to make that work requires regular combined exercises. A crucial part of the exercise program is to be able to build trust and understanding among the various sides. And in a number of cases, that is really at a sort of a person-to-person level. And so exercises ensure that those kinds of relationships, again, even at the person-to-person level, but at larger levels as well, are built, and doing exercises are a central part of being able to do that. A second piece to the exercises and a purpose is the deterrence signal it sends to North Korea. By doing the exercises, by demonstrating alliance coordination and combat capability, it sends a very significant message to North Korea. War on the Korean Peninsula would be a disaster. Deterrence is the primary function of the U.S. security commitment to ensure that that never happens. Exercises are an important measure to North Korea to help demonstrate a robust and proficient alliance that can continue to maintain a deterrence posture in regards to North Korea. Lastly, the exercises also send an important signal to South Korea as a measure of assurance to South Korea as a valued ally. The exercises and the alliance is an important signal of solidarity and the credibility of the alliance. And the exercises, again, help to reassure that posture. I would also maintain that the recipient of those signals are not only South Korea, it is also Japan. As these two alliances, while they are not formally linked, they have long been linked informally. And so Japan watches closely what happens in Korea and vice versa. And the degree to which the United States demonstrates a robust, solid security commitment, that is important and watched very closely by Japan as well. And so let me now turn then to my assessment of the central security questions and the central issues in regards to this study. And I would break this up into three different sections. And they essentially address, again, the key question: were the changes to the exercises, did they produce or have an associated risk that was acceptable and tolerable for the sake of supporting the diplomatic process that had been underway? And so let me start, first of all, with an assessment to the damage to any readiness that may have been the case and has been argued by those who have been concerned by this issue. First of all, to be absolutely sure, training did continue even though the exercises were altered. Some, again, were suspended, but a lot of the training continued in different forms, in smaller scale. And so that it wasn't about no training going on at all. Extensive training individually, unilaterally, as well as some combined exercises continued to go on. However, with that said, because of the training matrix that I mentioned earlier and the frequent rotations, including, as was pointed out to me, of the flag officers who are in the leadership positions that are there for 1 or 2 years, that there was a danger that you would lose the corporate knowledge that was part of the experience of exercising and passing on those sorts of lessons, and that the ability to pass on lessons learned to those who succeeded them was put in jeopardy, at least in the short term, since the exercise routine was not the same and was shortened, and some things, just simply because of the lack of large-scale exercises, were not done in quite the same way. To compensate for training, or for some of these changes, the training, as I mentioned, was restructured and scaled down, especially a lot of the large-scale combined exercises. What this did was push a lot of the training towards lower-level, unit-level sorts of training. And I heard from some sources that while there were concerns about losing the large-scale training, having more frequent, smaller-scale training actually did have some benefit based on the repetition that was experienced through more often lower-scale exercises that were part of the routine. But as one officer indicated to me, that when you look at all of that, without large-scale exercises, you often have to make certain assumptions that you can only practice in large-scale exercises. So you make those assumptions that you can do those things, conduct the smaller scale exercises, and then in the end, you're not always entirely sure you can do those things at the right times and in the right sort of structure until you exercise at a large scale or until they are tested in some sort of conflict. And so it was pointed out to me that the notion of sort of a football analogy here, that you can have in a football team the offensive line practice separately and have excellent practices, the receivers, the backs, but until you put it all together, you don't necessarily know that you have all the parts working. And some of the changes to the large-scale combined exercises raise some questions about whether those things could all, in fact, happen. One other interesting point was raised to me and was put in the context of the concept of normalization of deviance, where you have perhaps an incremental relaxation of standards. In this regard, the standards that are achieved by being able to train. And that this relaxation of standards happens until you have produced essentially an inadequate new standard that becomes the norm. And you are okay until this way may be perhaps tested again in some degree of combat operations. And now suddenly the training that you have done up to this point may be inadequate. So when you put all of these things together, I think it is clear that there has been some implication to training. Certainly there can be arguments about how much, and it's difficult to put a precise number on that, but it seems clear that readiness and some aspects of the training regime deteriorated as a result of the changes in exercises. But while the debate over the wisdom of altering exercises often referenced readiness, I think the other side of that argument really was more about the messaging piece to this and the second aspect of the assessment to my question. And it was the signal that these changes to the exercises sent to North Korea. I touched on this just a little bit at the start, and that was the notion that one side argued that changing the exercises, certainly suspending them, was foolish. That you gave North Korea some big concessions, didn't get much in return. In fact, North Korea was not going to give up its nuclear weapons anyway, and reducing the exercises is a fool's errand. In fact, that if you wanted to continue pressuring North Korea, if you believed that was a possibility, in fact, it was increasing pressure that was going to be the only way that that might work. And changing the exercises was not the correct way to go in that direction. On the other side, though, of course, proponents argued that this was a crucial measure to support diplomacy, that it helped reduce tensions. It helped lessen some of North Korea's security concerns because they regularly complain about the exercises and how they are a prelude to a possible invasion. And that these were just simply very important as a gesture of good faith on the United States and South Korea's part at this early stage in the negotiation process to be able to, again, help provide momentum for this process to continue going. Thus, I think it's important when you look at this debate over the exercises and readiness, in many respects, there is a military side to this argument, but there is also a political and a diplomatic side to this argument that can be different in regards to how you look at those things and may reflect more of a debate about the proper policy towards North Korea than it reflects necessarily the readiness question, although those things can certainly be linked. So let me then turn to the central issue here and the third part to this assessment, and that is about the question of diplomacy. And the changing of the exercises was an effort, and the suspending of and altering of the exercises was done to support diplomacy. Was the effect on military readiness and the associated risk that came along with that, was that acceptable? Was it tolerable in the short term to support the diplomatic process? Looking back, it is very easy to argue that the answer is no, that it was not something that was worth the effort and worth the risk. And certainly folks would point to the evidence that there was very little change in the denuclearization process, that there seemed to be very little effect on North Korea's position as a result of this. Also, North Korea did very little to adjust its exercises. Those we seem to believe that they continued as normal. Also, that it wasn't entirely clear that exercises were even necessarily that important to Kim Jong-un, certainly in comparison to sanctions relief. I go back to in March of 2018 when a South Korean delegation went to North Korea, and Kim Jong-un reportedly made a comment that he understood that exercises need to continue as long as they were at the same scope and scale, et cetera. So were exercises even necessarily that important to North Korea and its negotiating position? But with all that said, even if the prospects for success were low and that there was an impact on the readiness, on military readiness, I would argue that the associated short-term impact on military readiness was tolerable and was worth the effort and acceptable to be able to support diplomacy at this particular point in the process, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the United States and South Korean militaries, again, still trained extensively in unilateral exercises and in training, but also in combined exercises, but at a smaller scale. The militaries were still well trained and advanced. In the short term, the military capability did not suffer that much in regards to readiness from what the indicators seem to be. But also the measure of whether it was tolerable is contingent on what the security environment was at that particular point. And we were seeing tension levels decreasing significantly from 2017 and 2016. The summits were bringing tension levels down. We also had in September of 2018 the conclusion of the North-South Comprehensive Military Agreement, which further reduced military and political tensions. And lastly, I think it was very unlikely that North Korea would challenge the alliance in any sort of significant way with any sort of major combat operations. When you look at readiness, you have to ask the question, readiness to do what? And in this particular case, the training is very clearly focused on major combat operations in many respects on the Korean Peninsula. But the likelihood of that happening in the short term was very low, and so therefore the accompanying risk was tolerable and acceptable. With that said, I share the skepticism, again to repeat, that denuclearization was achievable in regards to the dialogue and such, and I still think it's unlikely we get to denuclearization. But again, to emphasize, I think the risk in altering the exercises was low, and pursuing diplomacy, even if it was a long shot, was worthwhile. But now the next question that arises is, how long can you continue this sort of altered exercise schedule? And do you get to some point at which down the road, the risk does become considerable and there has to be reconsideration for resuming the previous exercise schedule or something else from what we have currently? The number that I often heard in the interviews that I conducted was that you could go 2 to 3 years, maybe a little more, before you had significant damage to readiness, and that risk would go up significantly after that particular point. So when you look at the clock, if you will, we have gone, now if you start the clock at the fall of 2018, we have maybe a year and a half to go before we hit that 2 to 3 year marker. Is it going to be time to reconsider the exercise framework that is in place? Perhaps, but yet also the timeline may depend on what the security environment is, and it may depend on what the process and progress is on diplomacy. I think it's important to remember that the size and the details of exercises have always been adjustable throughout the history of the alliance. And so they can be ratcheted up, they can be ratcheted back, different assets, different missions can be part of the exercises. These things can be adjusted depending on the circumstances. And so let me conclude by saying that in the next year or two, there are going to have to be some reassessments and some decisions made about where the exercises go, and to see whether this current process and structure is the one that best fits the security environment and the process for and the place we are at in regards to diplomacy and security. So let me stop there and turn it over to my esteemed moderator and answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Terry. That was a very great presentation. I know when all this started happening, I was very confused as to what the reality of the situation was. There was a lot of short opinion pieces on whether these are right, the decision to suspend exercises, modify exercises was right, or whether it was wrong. And your paper really helped to provide a lot of clarity. It was very objective and clear-headed, and I thank you very much for your contribution, not only to KEI, but to the field. And so now I'll turn things over to, we had a slew of questions coming in, and I'll try and combine them where possible. Our first one comes from Liz Shim. She asks, how prepared are the U.S. and South Korea forces in the event of a sudden change in North Korea? And is China in better position to intervene in North Korea if there is a crisis of governance in Pyongyang? And then sort of piggying back off of that, David Delgado asks, what in your opinion would regime change or regime collapse look like? Would it be more slow moving, or would it be a bit more quick moving, involving maybe a serious scenario involving an eventual disaster, such as involving the weapons of mass destruction, something along those lines? So more or less about what's going on. Are we prepared for a sudden change in North Korea, and how does the U.S. And China factor into that?
Let me say, I'm completely shocked that I would get these questions, given the current circumstances that we are at. Between that and COVID-19, I was wondering about the relevance of this topic, but those are some great questions. So let me start by talking about the preparation level. The short answer is it's not entirely clear. There have been some reports that there is some planning that has been done. I'm not sure that enough has been done in that regard. But I think that this is really a difficult issue. First of all, how it's going to happen, to come to David Delgado's question as well. I think we could set up planning based on any number of different scenarios and not necessarily get that correct. But first of all, I think if this is, if there is truly something wrong with Kim Jong-un's health, and he passes away, or there is some sort of aspect of that, that is an internal political issue. I don't think the United States should or can necessarily intervene in that. That's going to have to be something that North Korea sorts out. Certainly we watch very closely in that regard and see what the warning signs may be, depending on the degree to which that evolves into a chaotic situation. But I think, certainly this is not the first transition we have had in the Kim family, and we did not intervene in the other two either. This is going to be something that North Korea will have to sort out. Now, certainly the fact that North Korea is a nuclear weapons state now adds a whole nother level to that and is going to be something that is crucial to watch. But I think the China element to this is really very important, because there is a number of reasons to think that China would perhaps be much more willing and certainly better placed to move into North Korea if there was some indication of extreme instability that in particular needed to perhaps try to lock down the nuclear chemical weapons, try to bring some degree of stability to North Korea. But I'm not so sure China would be necessarily that willing to leap into all of that either. But if something really starts to go badly, seriously, and there is a need to intervene, I think it is very important that the United States, China, and South Korea have had discussions about this. Because if we decide to act, if all of us decide to act, there is an awful lot of room to get in each other's way. And I think that could have some very, very serious consequences.
Thanks, Terry. Now we'll turn to a couple of COVID questions. I'm sure you probably are expecting these as well. One on the North Korean side and one on the South Korean side. Duncan Bartlett, editor of Asian Affairs, said, what are we to make of reports that the North Korean military has been affected by coronavirus and that Kim Jong-un is seriously ill or recovering from heart surgery? And then on the flip side of that, also corona-related, Kim Dong-hyun from VOA America, VOA Korean service, says, I was wondering how COVID-19 would impact joint exercises as well as OPCON transition, as that is directly related with postponement of joint exercises.
Yeah, let me sort of work in reverse. The COVID-19, there certainly have been concerns among U.S. forces as well as South Korean forces in regards to making sure that the virus is contained and does not damage readiness. The reports that I have seen indicate that there have been some very strong proactive measures taken, and that has been a good story so far, that they have been successful in that, and so that it has not necessarily had any major impact on readiness, at least at this particular point, as far as I can see in the reporting that's been coming out of South Korea in regards to the military. On the North Korean side, of course, what's interesting, I believe the story this morning was there were 790 cases tested in North Korea, but still no reports of COVID-19 positive results in North Korea. Of course, no one really buys that particular answer, but how widespread COVID-19 is in North Korea is hard to tell. I think your question, though, also, if I could take this as an opportunity to broaden it just a little bit, raises some questions about the broader North Korean military. When you look at the use of the military, the North Korean military, for harvesting, for construction projects, some of the reports about the overall health of some of the individual soldiers, the story of the North Korean defector, the soldier who raced across the DMZ and was shot at on his way across, and then his health, his physical after he arrived indicated that he had a number of tapeworms in his system. All of those things point to some very significant questions about the readiness on the North Korean side, that certainly not to downplay the danger and the capabilities of the North Korean military, but I think there are some important asterisks that need to be included in that assessment and included in your assessments when looking at the North Korean conventional forces. As far as Kim Jong-un's health, your guess is as good as mine, as those different reports have been coming out. You hear everything from, I believe one report had him being brain dead in a hospital bed, to grave danger was CNN's report, to he may have had heart surgery and is recovering, to he's just fine and is just not in Pyongyang. So I think we just have to wait and see how this all plays out. Certainly it has revved up again a wonderful cottage industry in North Korean studies of looking at the succession story and what might be the possible succession route should Kim Jong-un actually be incapacitated. Certainly there is one element to that question, that it could be who becomes the caretaker in his stead, similar to when Kim Jong-il fell out of view in 2008, and Jang Song-taek reportedly was the power behind the scenes. Could that potentially happen if Kim Jong-un's health deteriorates, all the way to what happens if he passes away, and then what happens? And there are a number of possibilities, as many of you have seen in the press, that are interesting speculation, but I think we have to always be very humble in deciding that we know exactly where this is going to go, because I think we just don't.
Thank you for that pragmatic answer. I know Twitter has certainly been very focused on this for the past few days. Now we'll turn to something else that has been very popular in the news recently, and that is the SMA. Emma Chanlett-Avery at CRS is asking, how does the lapse in the SMA impact readiness? There's a lot of things to consider, including the furloughed workers at base, the possible further reduction in exercises, and diminished trust in the alliance more broadly.
Yes, and I think that raises some really serious questions. I have not been a fan at all of how the SMA dialogue has gone. I think we need to do a better job of treating our allies. We say in all of our strategic documents the importance of allies for the U.S. security position, and yet how these SMA talks have evolved with South Korea, I think, are very important. I think absolutely they undercut the confidence in the alliance among South Koreans. That has an effect on readiness. It may be less on sort of the specific exercise training side to that, but it certainly undercuts a good deal of the political foundations to the alliance. And if this continues on, it could add more to that and could make that even worse in regards to the effect on the alliance. And I'm concerned about that. I think this is something that we need to do a better job in regards to alliance management, not only with South Korea, but I think also Japan, again, is watching these events very closely, as their SMA is up next, I believe, next year. And so I share those concerns about what this means for the alliance.
We'll turn now to Emma's colleague at CRS, Mark Mannion, who has two questions. The first, by way of comparison, did you look at previous gestures to alter exercises to benefit diplomacy? And the second, looking forward, what lessons can we learn about how to calibrate exercises to complement future episodes of diplomacy with North Korea? For instance, not issuing such sweeping pronouncements.
Yeah, I mean, I think on a couple of different levels there. First of all, how this was coordinated needed to be done in a much better fashion. To have our ally be surprised by this announcement was unhelpful. And the Pentagon was surprised, as far as I understand, as well. And so first of all, the coordination that needs to be done that's part of this, I think that was a central part to this. I think it certainly was appropriate with this coordination assumed that the United States could have set aside with South Korea one or two of the early exercises as part of simply a diplomatic gesture to be able to support diplomacy. After that, I think certainly an argument could be made that the exercise structure still could have been something that the United States and South Korea were flexible on, but it could have been more a part of the direct negotiation process to see what kinds of concessions may have been possible with that, what kinds of linkages could have been possible with that. And so I think the follow-on approach that was part of that as well is something that could have been done differently. I think another lesson that is part of this is it's not entirely clear to me how important the exercises and changing them are to Kim Jong-un. I think when you stack all of the different concessions that North Korea would like to have, sanctions relief is much higher than changing the exercise structure. But I think what's interesting to look at here is there are some other ways that you can frame how to go about the exercises that perhaps is another lesson learned. I go through this in the paper, but I didn't deal with this in the presentation. And that is how General Brooks, who was the USFK commander in the early part of these days, how he went about developing a framework for structuring the exercises. He talked about how he looked at exercises as having four components, or four dials, if you will. And they were scale, scope, timing, and then the communication volume. Scale was the idea of how big the exercises were. Scope was the notion of what kinds of things you necessarily exercised. So for example, when we made very public that we were exercising decapitation strikes, preemptive actions in 2016, 2017, those kinds of things matter, what you're deciding to exercise. And then also the timing, when you do these exercises, and do you do them in response to a North Korean action, perhaps to send a message directly to the North Koreans about some particular provocation they have undertaken, or pull back on the exercises because of a gesture the North Koreans have made. So scope, scale, timing, and then the last item was communication volume. How loudly do you advertise and promote these other three items in regards to your exercises? And I think an important part of this is that you could dial back any one of these, like the notion of a rheostat, depending on what effect you are trying to gain through the exercises. And in particular, the last one, the communication volume, you can dial that back. In other words, dial back the publicity, but you're still doing all the other training aspects of it and not losing any readiness, but perhaps dialing down the deterrence message that you are sending to North Korea to try to perhaps, again, support diplomacy in that way without jeopardizing the readiness piece to that. I think another important lesson of these events is that these exercises can be tailored in ways that communicate certain messages. They also don't necessarily have to be as overly provocative if that's not necessarily the intent that is intended, and also that the volume can be scoped so that you don't lose readiness, but yet the volume that is part of the communication isn't necessarily quite so much in North Korea's face, if that is in fact the intent you are seeking. Again, there certainly are times when you will want to advertise and make sure that volume is turned up because you may be trying to send a clear message of deterrence to North Korea as well as reassurance to the South.
Our next question, Terry, comes from Robert Gay, who asks, do you think economic power will play a more important role given the economic rise of China and its importance to North Korea?
Well, and that is the interesting question that goes back to discussions even from a couple of years ago when we started looking at sanctions being implemented on North Korea. And so, of course, the sanctions begin when North Korea first starts to test nuclear weapons. And they are relatively targeted sanctions on military goods, dual-use technology, luxury goods. But as the testing continues and it is believed that we need to exert more pressure, the sanctions continue to be ratcheted up to the point where they are today, and where they are hitting key North Korean industries that make a difference. The key question, though, has always been enforcement of these sanctions, in particular China's enforcement of the sanctions. China is North Korea's economic lifeline, and China could certainly turn up the economic pain on North Korea if it chose to do so. But the Chinese have been reluctant to do so because they fear that to get the effect that you are looking for in regards to changing North Korean behavior would require increasing the sanctions to levels that could possibly lead to chaos in the regime or a destabilizing of the North Korean regime. Now, to be sure, China was absolutely unhappy with North Korean behavior in 2017 in particular, and supported the sanctions that were part of that process. Today, the reports that I see indicate that there is still relatively strong support for enforcing the sanctions, but that some of the sanctions enforcement, particularly on China and Russia's part, has waned somewhat. But I think that at this particular point, it's hard to see economic sanctions are going to cause the change in North Korean behavior. But again, there are variables that we need to watch, and uncertainty. When you are looking at so many things in regards to North Korea, I think you have to be careful and humble that you necessarily are able to predict exactly what the future is going to lead to.
I'm going to bundle two questions again. This first one comes from Henry Collins and asks, how do you assess the view of a potential Biden administration toward maintaining the non-exercise policy? And then the second question comes from Bruce Klingner, who asks, when does one conclude the military exercises cancellation experiment has failed? He lists a few examples that suggest they're not as helpful. They haven't been as, suspending the exercises hasn't been as helpful as one might think. So when does one conclude the military exercises have failed? The suspension of military exercises have failed.
Yes, and let me start with Bruce's question, and that's a really important question. And certainly, as I premised my opening remarks, there can still be a great deal of debate over the wisdom of the exercises and the impact, et cetera, et cetera. My view, again, is that I think it was worth the effort when we started this process. Again, how it was done was not optimal. But I think, as you note in your question, that there becomes a point where military readiness, first of all, in its own right, has a shelf life. And how long can you go before you lose serious elements of that military capability that you have to decide we have to return to some element of where we were before, and reclaim, if you will, some of the military capabilities or readiness that perhaps we have lost. Again, the degree to which you measure how much was lost depends, and again, my interviews point to different assessments of that by some of the military folks. But I think, your question again gets to, are we at a point here where we certainly have to reassess whether the diplomatic process and whether the impact on military readiness points to the need to reassess where we are headed. And I think that's very, very true, that it is probably, if we don't see much in regards to change in this process, I think it's likely that the exercises will need to return back to some degree of normalcy. But again, those can always be adjusted, again, depending on how the diplomatic situation is and what the security environment is going to be. To sort of latch that on to the Biden question, one of the interesting wild cards when I give talks about where we go from here in regards to the whole denuclearization process, certainly the 2020 U.S. election is going to be a huge variable in that regard. I think it's not hard to argue that this process has gone as long as it has in regards to emphasis on diplomacy because of the personal investment that President Trump has in this. He has a personal relationship in his mind with Kim Jong-un, and that has been a major driver in maintaining this process. With the election and with all the COVID-19 stuff, that has certainly been put on hold as the administration just does not have the bandwidth to pursue this, as well as perhaps in North Korea as well, depending on what the truth ends up being in regards to Kim Jong-un's health. But if Trump is reelected, then there's a chance that the diplomatic process may be re-energized, and there may be a chance to explore some of this. Now, of course, for some, that is good news, as it may open the possibility for diplomacy. Some, though, are concerned about what kind of a deal the United States might strike with North Korea. But on the Biden side of this, if Joe Biden were to win the election, the only indicator that we have so far in regards to his view on approaching North Korea is the New York Times survey that was done of all the presidential candidates when we had quite a long list. And they were asked what their views were on certain foreign policy problems. And Biden was one of the few that went into, I believe, a little more detail than some of the others. But he was very skeptical of the diplomatic process, felt that too much had been given to North Korea in return for not much, and so seemed a bit more skeptical of where he would go with that process. However, he did say that he would still be willing to talk with North Korea to continue a diplomatic process, but clearly he's not going to be as personally invested as a Trump administration would be. But how much energy Biden puts into that remains to be seen. If I had to guess in regards to the exercise question, I think we will likely have some return to some of the exercise functions that we have had in the past. But again, I think an important clarification to make. When you look at the exercises in 2016 and 2017, the security environment was very different then compared to, say, 2012, 2006, pick your year, that in the years prior to 2018, there were very clear concerns about the security environment and the need to send a very decisive message to North Korea. Is that need still the case in 2019, 2020, excuse me, I'm sorry, and my years off here, in 2020, 2021, that you may have a return to something else, but it may not necessarily be what we saw in 2017, 2016, but it may be something that approaches more of a robust exercise schedule than we have seen in the last year or so.
Terry, we got a couple more questions to get to. I'll give you them separately. The first one is from Ben Monsier. He asks, under the assumption that North Korea will not denuclearize and will have a secure second strike capability, how does that affect U.S. force posture that has been more structured to deter conventional threats on the peninsula?
And I think that's a really important question because what is the alternative? If North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear capability, then I think, to phrase it bluntly, we have to learn how to live with a nuclear North Korea. And that is going to mean that we have to continue to buttress our posture to deter a nuclear North Korea now in the case of that particular eventuality. I am not necessarily one who feels that the answer is that we have to then, deploy tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea, that it is about bolstering U.S. nuclear weapons in the theater. Certainly some South Koreans argue that there's a need for South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons. I am much more sanguine that even with a nuclear North Korea can continue to be deterred at the strategic level, as we have done for the last 60 plus years, and that it's not going to necessarily require a major change in the U.S. force posture. I think we have to, and I'm not sure we have really done this as clearly as we need to, but to outline to North Korea some clear red lines here. First of all, about proliferation. I think for the last several years now, with the focus on the long-range ICBM and a nuclear capability with that, we have lost what had been our earlier chief concern, and that is North Korea proliferating nuclear materials, nuclear technology to other states. I think we have to return to that as a central focus of U.S. policy and make that clear in no uncertain terms to North Korea. And then we also have to include that North Korea, and to emphasize that if those weapons are ever used, the result will be disastrous to the North Korean regime. I think we have to emphasize that in much greater detail than we necessarily have. And again, I am not convinced that we have to do anything that is that much more different than what we are doing currently to be able to deter North Korea. The bigger concern, in my view, is perhaps North Korea moving to feel more confident in lower level types of actions or provocations, because it feels it now has the ultimate sort of backstop with nuclear weapons. I think we have to watch that. I'm not convinced North Korea has or will go down that road, but that's much more concerning to me than necessarily North Korea using any sort of offensive nuclear strikes or offensive nuclear coercion. I think North Korea can be deterred, and that can be something that does not require a major change in the U.S. force posture in East Asia.
So we're almost out of time, but I think that this last question is really important. It comes from Mark Toca, KEI's vice president. He asks, will it be possible to resume exercises without raising tension? And is there any reason to believe that South Korea would want to resume exercises?
Yeah, and this is a great point to clarify and to end on, because again, to emphasize, I can't emphasize enough that exercises have been going on extensively. But what has happened is some of the exercises have been scaled back to be smaller. The exercises have been driven down to more the unit level. There have also still been combined exercises that have been part of this, but just not as large. And so I think that there still has been a good deal of training and readiness that is there. But are some things lost? Again, my sense from the interviews is that there are things that are concerning, particularly as the time continues beyond this 2 to 3 year marker that will need to be revisited. But I think that's a crucial question mark, because whenever you conduct exercises, again, how you do them, what you do, you can do exercises that are defensive, that are careful, that are carefully constructed, but you can also do exercises that are overly provocative. And so I think there has to be care taken to carefully craft your exercises to be able to, certainly on the readiness side, ensure that readiness, but on the messaging side, to think about how that needs to be done. And perhaps there is more about doing that needs to be thought about in relation to your question, Mark. And we'll see in the years ahead how this exercise structure gets revisited and done differently, perhaps based on the security environment.
Well, Terry, you've done a fantastic job of answering these questions, and I want to thank everyone for the fantastic questions. There really has been a very thought-provoking discussion, and Terry, like I said, you certainly gave us a lot to think about and to consider moving forward. But before we say goodbye to everyone, I just want to give a reminder that next week at the same time, we'll be doing a program called North Korea and the Coronavirus, which will take place this same time, 2 to 3 p.m. Next Thursday, April 30th, including my colleague Troy Sangarone, Chung Pak, and Keith Luce, talking about different aspects of how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting North Korea. So I hope to see everyone there. And I want to thank you, Terry, and thank you everyone else again for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kyle.